I really don't believe in ghosts, but this series of events was absolutely strange, and I don't know what to make of it. I'm naturally very skeptical, and if you can debunk this, that would be cool. These events all happened a few years ago while I was in college, and it was over the course of a few months while I was pet sitting a few different times. In college, I did a lot of pet sitting for extra money. It was a great side job. Get paid to hang out with dogs and take care of them. Nice. A lot of the time I would stay at the person's house because it helped the dogs stay calm to have someone with them, and because the owners wanted to make sure that nothing went wrong with their house while they were gone. So there was one house. It was old and in a very quiet neighborhood. As in, I don't think anyone in the neighborhood was under the age of 55 or 60, and I very rarely even heard cars on the roads. The backyard was very deep and had tons of trees, so you couldn't see your backyard neighbor because of all the foliage, and both houses to the side were empty. One was under construction, and the other was a rental that was empty and stayed empty for months. I'm pretty sure the lady who owns the house I was helping with said that the owner was very sick. Either way, the neighborhood noise factor was absolutely zero, which was great for a big old dog and a student trying to study. Now on to the weird bits. The house was close enough to my university that I could swing by during my breaks between classes to let the dog out. One day, right around noon, I was standing in the dining room sorting the owner's mail, junk mail and ads that she had asked me to throw away. On the table, there was an unopened, full, 20-pound bag of dog food. It was near the center of the table. The walls of the dining room were about 3 feet from the edge of the table, enough to walk around and scoot a chair out, but not large. Anyway, I'm standing there, still, sorting the mail. The dog's laying at my feet, also still. There are no cars driving by, no air, no draft, and this 20-pound bag of dog food suddenly goes flying off the table, hard enough to hit the wall. It went parallel to the floor, hit the wall, and dropped down. Not like it just fell over and hit the floor. It looked like it had been swept off the table, or thrown somehow, but nothing in the entire house was moving. The AC wasn't even on. I remember because I had been considering turning it on for the afternoon, in case the dog got hot. I had to get back to class, but I didn't understand how it could have happened. How does a full bag of dog food fly something like 4 or 5 feet so fast and hit the wall so hard? The next time I was there a few weeks later, this owner traveled a bit for work. I was there frequently. I was feeding the dog. Now, this dog is old, so he had a metal food stand for his bowls, so he didn't have to bend down so far. You could always hear when he was eating or drinking, because the food bowls would clank against the stand. This time, I heard the clanking for a while, and thought it was weird that the dog was taking so long to eat his dinner. Usually, he was very quick about it. I'd been getting my stuff set up to start my homework, and could still hear the clanking. I didn't think anything of it. Maybe he was getting a really long drink, I thought, until I looked down and realized the dog was right next to me, and I could still hear the clanking. I got up to see what was going on, but the second I turned the corner and could see the food bowls, the clanking stopped. I checked if the bowls were over or under a vent, or if a window was open. I checked if there were any cars going by, but I hadn't heard anything, and I was closer to the road getting my homework set up than the dog bowl was, by a significant amount. Also, the sound was very rhythmic. I thought a dog was eating after all, and it was late enough that the construction crew next door had wrapped up hours before. It also stopped the second I saw the bowl, not before or after. After that, I asked my girlfriend to come and stay with me while I was there. One night we were hanging out watching Netflix and petting the dog. We decided to go to bed and pause the show. It was about 1 AM. Just a reminder, both houses on either side were empty, and the backside neighbor was too far away to even see. After a moment or so of silence, both my girlfriend and I and the dog heard a voice speaking. The dog perked his ears up and was looking between the front and back doors. My girlfriend heard the noise from around the front door. I heard it around the back, nearer the dining room with the table and the dog bowls. The sound was fairly distinctively someone speaking, but it sounded muffled, like from another room. We looked out the windows, but there were no other lights on in the neighborhood, and we heard no cars. Like I said, old person neighborhood. We didn't see anyone outside, despite the streetlights and clear lines of sight. No one could get into the rental property. It was padlocked up tight, and you could see pretty well through the gutted construction, and there wasn't anyone there either. The dog also couldn't pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Had it been a car driving by or radio, the house was dead center of a long residential road, and the only other road dead-ended directly into this house, as in, if the curtains weren't drawn, oncoming headlights from this road would be blinding. But there weren't any headlights or tail lights on the road, and no car noises that we could hear. Other than a few random things, the last thing that happened was the next time I stayed there. My girlfriend and I were getting ready. She was in the bathroom, I was getting dressed in the bedroom right next door. There was a small hallway between the two doors, and we both heard a woman's voice scream my name, but sounded faint. But the sound was originating from the hallway. My name is fairly unique, and that was also the only sound. Had it been someone outside yelling, which the sound acoustics would have had to have been insane for it to sound that way into the interior hallway of another house, at least 2 houses away, I imagine we also would have heard something else they were yelling. Both my girlfriend and I stepped out of our rooms we were in, independently of the other. We both heard it, and hadn't said anything ourselves. I don't know if the dog heard this one. He wasn't in my line of sight. The last thing I remember happening was the last night I stayed there. I was by myself. This one is a little weird because I was asleep, so take that as you will. I easily could have been dreaming, but it was still odd, so I'm including it. Typically, when I fall asleep, nothing in the world will wake me up. I have to be very careful with my alarms. Dogs barking, sirens, storms. I've slept through it all. This last night though, I woke up completely. You know how you're normally groggy when you wake up? I'm normally that, times 10. But in the middle of the night, I woke up from a dead sleep. Not even dreaming, that I can remember. Completely and totally awake and lucid. I didn't open my eyes though. Maybe just a bad feeling. I was asleep near the edge of the bed, and I heard what I assumed was that same woman's voice. It sounded like it was coming from the edge of the bed, like someone was crouched there talking to me. This bedroom is far away from the front and back doors, where I heard the sound before, but it was the same, like a woman speaking, but from a different room, just somehow closer. I didn't open my eyes at any point. The way I saw it, there was either going to be something there, or there wasn't. Either way, it wasn't going to be good, so I just rolled over and went back to sleep. I asked the owner, and she said that she definitely thought the place was haunted. Now, people I have told this story to have offered a few suggestions. And yes, this house did have a basement, but the only thing down there was a washer and dryer, which I never used, and were never on while I was there. The owner had almost had most of the insulation in the house replaced, so I don't know that it could be rats or mice in the walls. I heard many squirrels and small animals on the roof, and none of the sounds matched what I heard. None of the appliances did either. Like I said, I stayed there a lot. I got used to the regular sounds of the house, and I imagine the dog was even more used to the regular sounds, and he reacted a few times to the unexpected. Street noise was easy to keep track of, and there was very little, and the construction crew next door worked regular hours, about 7 AM to 3 PM. It was a very safe neighborhood overall, and the type of neighborhood with quaint houses and rose trellises, if that gives you an idea. There were a few other odd incidents, weird bruising, lights flickering, creaks, but those are easily explainable. Wood floors, old house and weird lights, and me being in a somewhat unfamiliar place and probably bumping into more things than usual. I wouldn't consider those things anything too odd. The dog was fine, by the way. Although the owner thought it was haunted, she thought it was benign for her and her dog. It just seemed like it didn't like me. I'm happy to report that the dog lived a happy life, and the owner moved out of that house to live with her new husband eventually. I lost contact after that, unfortunately. I stopped pet sitting when I got a real job after college. Definitely very odd, and the only house I've ever stayed in where I felt genuinely uncomfortable to be alone. So first off, I generally don't believe most ghost stories I hear. That said, I have seen a ghost. Indisputable proof as far as I'm concerned. Let me take you back to when I was probably 12 or 13 and tell you a story of how I thought I was going to die. As for the year this happened, think Stranger Things and you'll have an approximate year. Think early 80s. For a little backstory, in our small town of about 7,000 people, there was a graveyard that was on a dirt road about a mile from anything. I lived on that dirt road just outside of town, so we could have horses, but a few miles from there. The graveyard was much further out. Everyone knew about it. It even had a great axe murderer ghost story to it. I knew where it was, but had never been. When I was in 7th grade, well, summer between 7 and 8, one of my good friend's grandfathers had come to town for a visit. I had met most of his family over the years, but had never heard of his granddad, so I was surprised to find out he was in town. Since I spent most days with my friend, typically at his house, he was in town, closer to video games. I met him and spent time talking to him and got to know him a little. His wife had died many years before. I'm sure at 12 it sounded like she died in the Civil War, and he just spent his retirement driving around America looking for haunted places. Now, as an adult, I have so very many questions about that, but at the time, I just accepted it and didn't dwell. One night after dinner at my friend's house, his granddad asked if there were any haunted places in town. My friend's parents poo-pooed it and said no, but then they left the room, and my friend was like, "There is a haunted cemetery." I mentioned my disbelief, but his granddad's eyes lit up and he asked where it was. Obviously, my friend was quick to tell him. So whereas my friend's house was in town, it was about half a mile from my dirt road. I was about 3 miles one way, and the graveyard was about 1 mile the other way. I was close. Armed with this knowledge, Granddad decided that we would walk to the graveyard the next night. I was pragmatic and risk-averse in those days, and expressed my concern with walking to an isolated graveyard in the middle of nowhere at midnight. Oh yeah, he wanted to be there at midnight, but he assured me that he had encountered many ghosts and that we would be safe. Not really believing the place was haunted, I agreed to go. So I go over to my friend's house the next day. I practically lived there in the summer, and we hang out, do our thing, but Granddad seems lit up with excitement. I thought about telling him the ghost stories were made up, but we had a pass to stay up all night, and I wasn't going to mess that up. He would have to deal with his disappointment on his own time. Not knowing exactly how far it was, believe it or not, smartphones haven't been around forever. We headed out at like 10:30 to walk down a dirt road for over a mile with no house or building along the way. No streetlights on dirt roads to nowhere. The dirt road came along the south side of the cemetery to where it intersected with the dirt road the entrance is on. All along the cemetery was a small grove of trees, blocking all view into it. You knew it was on the other side of the wrought iron fence. You just couldn't see in. We turned onto the next dirt road to the entrance of the cemetery and walked up to the gates. Oh yeah, there were gates. Very old wrought iron gates with an arch on the top. On each side of the narrow dirt road, lined with pine trees leading in, was a stone gargoyle. I shit you not, stone gargoyles and wrought iron. We went in and walked the 500 feet or so to the end of the road. It was one road that circled a statue of Christ in a teardrop shape at the end. Someone had money, and you go back the way you came, not built for two-way traffic. The cemetery was mostly to the left or north, with a few tombstones to the right, and then the trees blocking all view that way. When we got to the end, it was probably 11:30, but I didn't have a watch and couldn't be sure. We talked about how legend has it the Christ statue bleeds on Halloween. Believable, right? And that there is an axe murderer, who no one knows the name of, that was buried and haunting the place. Understand my skepticism? We talked like this for a while, and at some point, my friend started arguing with his granddad, and that's when I heard it. That was it. One click, then nothing. At the time, it sounded like two rocks being struck together, like small rocks, but I can assure you after much trial and error, that wasn't exactly the sound. A few minutes later, again, assuming the time here, my friend still arguing, I hear. Only this time, it was in a different location. That must have been when my spidey senses started kicking in, because I started telling them to shut up and listen, but they didn't. Again from somewhere else. This time my friend's granddad was like, "Did you hear that?" I imagine my response was typical of a 12-year-old who had been trying to tell you. I don't know if I said anything. A few moments later. What the hell? Did it just go from 1 to 2? Also, from a completely different location. I don't know if it was the full moon, but if it wasn't, it was close because it was pretty bright out there. I'm looking all through the graveyard for any movement. Now my friend and I are pretty nervous, not really sure what's going on, but I know I don't like it. It's never from the same place, and we don't see anyone moving. Grandad lays on his stomach and starts looking across the graveyard. I'm sure someone asked. He told us you could come see movement against the skyline better, which, amazingly in the bright moonlight, you could. All three of us laying in the grass. I really couldn't say why, but it was when it did 3 clicks that I knew we were in trouble. It kept coming from different places, so I sure wasn't going anywhere, which I think deep down I also realized was a problem. All of us were silent, straining to see any movement ahead. It sounded close, but not right there, if that makes any sense. Still moving around. Geez, like I know time is running out. Grandad also seemed agitated. My friend was looking about how I imagine I was looking. No movement, no sound, no wind. At that moment, something came walking towards us. It was right there, maybe 12 feet away, and coming towards us. One moment it wasn't there, and the next, it was. It didn't really seem like it appeared right then, but I don't know. Like there was a shrub there all along I didn't really pay attention to, until it stood up and came towards me. I really can't explain that part. It was just there. I'm scrambling to my feet. My friend is clawing his way to his feet, and Grandad's slowly standing up and tells us to run. Well, we were already moving. Now, in that slowed down brain thing, when you're scared as hell, I make a point to look at its feet. Without dating myself too badly, but when I was a kid, the killer in the slasher movies always wore boots. I guess I was just looking for confirmation that we were really going to die. There were no feet. What approached us was like cloaked, the outside grey and the inside completely pitch black. No feet. I could clearly see under it. I was laying down, remember? Some robed figure was quickly advancing. My friend and I started running towards the gate, and sure as hell, that thing lit out after us. Grandad starts yelling some crazy-ass Latin stuff. It starts out "Care." Found out later, it's a Pueblo Indian chant to keep away the dead. And the thing stops, keeps turning from us to him, back and forth, making a decision. And then it sunk into the ground. Gone. We didn't stop, kept running until we were on the dirt road and waited for Grandad. He came walking out, excited as hell, but we were no longer amused and wanted to go home. We walked the 100 feet to my dirt road and then walked past the wooded cemetery again. After halfway past, we heard the most chilling scream from the graveyard. We all stopped. That was definitely the closest I've ever come to pissing myself. My blood froze, my hair stood up, and I shivered. It scared me. Grandad takes a step back towards the graveyard, and we are like, "What the hell? Where are you going?" He tells us someone might need help. I remember looking at him, saying, "Yeah, us. We need to get home." We turned and walked the rest of the way to my friend's house. As we were going to sleep, Grandad stopped by the room and said, "Let's go again tomorrow night." I can't remember if I slept much or not. At that age, you could go for days. The next morning, right after breakfast, Grandad said he was going to walk to the graveyard to look at it in the daytime. Honestly, I have no idea if this man had a car. I was a really self-absorbed kid upon reflection. Naturally, armed with sunlight, I was very interested in going back. Funny how the sun makes a difference in matters like this. We left the house fairly early, maybe around 10ish. I really didn't keep track of time back then, and walked to the graveyard along the dirt road. In the light of the day, it was a fairly pleasant walk. We passed fields for cattle, and some, well, unused apparently, but it was pleasant, and I didn't have a sense of dread, which was nice. I couldn't tell you what time we got there, but it was early afternoon, and we walked right to the big statue of Christ at the end of the road. We kind of stood there, looking around, getting our bearings and checking things out. I'll be honest, I really don't remember who noticed which things. I just know what we discovered. We all went into detective mode and started looking around. Fairly quickly, we saw that the grave, about 10 feet from where we were, directly in front of where we were laying, had a statue of the Virgin Mary next to it. Maybe 2 feet tall, robed figure, eerily familiar, and pretty much where I first saw whatever. We discussed this in great length and all agreed that what we saw was a robed figure, lightish on the outside, black on the inside. Upon reflection, I find it quite interesting that we didn't discuss what we saw until that moment. Obviously, it wasn't a 2-foot statue that approached us, but the similarity was not lost on us. We then went to look at where it disappeared, and nope, no ditch, no depression, no secret Scooby-Doo hidey hole, just flat ground. I'm pretty sure this was when Grandad told us what he was shouting was an ancient Pueblo Indian chant to keep away the dead. I'm not likely to forget that. I can't remember the chant, but I know I heard it. Unfortunately, that doesn't give me much comfort. I don't feel like I could shout, "K. Ray, it's a chant to keep you away, don't make me say the rest," and it would work. It was bright and sunny, and hard to picture the terror from the night before. We were investigators, and I was personally invested. The graveyard went north about a quarter mile. Most of the tombstones were 50 years old or more. At the northern edge, they were much older. Other than the statue, there was nothing else. After about an hour, we went back to my friend's house. Grandad still wanted to go back that night and told us we didn't have to go. It was fine if we stayed home. I'm not sure what my reasoning was, but I was in for another go. I think that was the first time I realized that I have a high threshold for fear. Maybe it was because I said I was in and he wasn't going to be left out. Maybe because my friend was as stupid as me, but he was also in for the ride. It was agreed we would go back again tonight, come what may. If you thought the hours moved slow when you were young, this was like dog years for a kid. That day just wouldn't end until it did. We were watching something on TV when Grandad walks up and says, "It's time." I felt like I was part of the A-team and we were about to run a mission. It was time. We left later this time, now that we knew how long it took to get there. Of course the goal was still midnight. It went so well the first time. As we walked, I started wondering what was up with the ghost. Why did it come after my friend and me, and not Grandad, who was just standing there? I started to be a bit concerned about it, to be honest, but we were nearly there, and I sure wasn't going to wimp out. We got to the gate just before midnight. Who knew Grandad wore a watch? And we stood there, looking at the gargoyles and the dark entrance. Yeah, full moon or not, it was overcast and dark as hell. We all looked at each other, took a deep breath, and my friend and I wimped out. "I can't do it, sorry." I don't know which one said it first, but the other immediately agreed. Just so we're clear, it very well might have been me who chickened out first. Regardless, I'm glad we did. "That's fine, I'm just gonna go in there for a minute and look around." And in goes Grandad. There we are, slowly realizing that we're standing alone on a dirt road, surrounded by trees on all sides of the road, watching Grandad disappear into the darkness of the tree-covered entrance. He was just out of sight when we heard it. Somewhere in the graveyard, it was starting up again. My friend and I alone in the dark in front of a really creepy graveyard. This was a bad idea. Without saying a word, we had a very in-depth conversation about running away. Wait, what? What happened to the other two single clicks? This is happening fast. Two 13-year-old boys, alone in the dark, miles from help. Grandad is in there somewhere, but he's not here. What if it just comes for us? Where's Grandad? Doesn't he know we have to go now? What if we just run? He will be okay, right? What if we run and it finds us, and Grandad isn't there? K. Ray, in a loud booming voice, moving towards us quickly. Everything stands still. No wind, no sound other than the chanting of Grandad. Then, movement in the darkness, coming towards us, moving fast. It's entirely possible we were holding hands at this point, because it was like we were moving as one. No communication needed. 1 step, 2 steps, we're just starting to run, when we see Grandad running down the narrow road out of the graveyard towards us. We stop. Here comes help. It occurs to me that it's not a good sign that he's running. I don't know what level of scared crapless I was before I thought about why he was running, but I was plenty scared when I realized Grandad was scared enough to run. Despite every inclination to run, upon seeing Grandad, we stopped, waited for him to get to us. It felt like years watching him run towards us. We were across the dirt road from the entrance, I guess around 12 feet away, watching as Grandad came towards us. At the time,
I didn't think anything of it, but upon reflection, the man was pretty badass because he was full on jogging, no sign of age there. Out of the darkness of the tree-lined road he ran, through the gates, and to us. I can't describe the relief I felt when he got to us. I knew I was completely out of my depth and had no business being there. Grandad did. This was his thing, and now he was with us. We were safe. I thought you two might have run away, and that's why I ran out. I didn't want you out here alone, says Grandad, as he turns around to look at the graveyard. Nothing. Silence. We turn and start walking home. Many questions on my mind when I feel it. We all felt it. We all turn and look at the entrance of the cemetery as we walk away. I feel it long before I see it. Angry, hateful, violent. In the darkness between the trees is another, darker darkness, and it's moving fast. I'm positive there was no sound, but in my head, it was a loud scream, full of anger and disappointment. That might just be my imagination. Things were a bit out of control right then, but that's what I felt. Racing up the strip of gravel that was the road in the cemetery was a cloaked figure that I knew too well. It was moving fast, incredibly fast. We started to run as it raced towards the gate. My feet are moving, and we're starting to run, but not nearly as fast as this thing. I feel dread, hopelessness. I know there's no way we're going to outrun this, but I'm sure giving it my best. Just as we start moving, it flies down the road to the gate, moving so very fast. It will only take a second before it's on us. I feel weak, but keep my feet moving. So fast, it closes the last few feet to the gate. We're running, looking back as it closes in. It stops, like it hit a brick wall. It stops at the gate. We run, it watches. I feel the anger radiating from it. I run faster. I can't tell you how I ran while looking back, laser focused on the shrouded figure, twitching and jerking as it watched us run off, but I did. I ran like the wind, and so did my friend and Grandad. I think it watched us far longer than we could see it. We eventually stopped running and walked the rest of the way home. No one talked. We got home, and my friend and I went to bed. I doubt I slept that night. I went home the next day and didn't go back to my friend's house for a while. His granddad left a few days later, and I never saw him again. Just before the next school year, that friend moved away, and I never saw him again. Another friend of mine, actually a fairly new friend at the time, who would be with me for the next 30 plus years, and then tell other kids this story, did call Grandad after I told him all of this. I don't know exactly what was said, but at the end, my friend said the 12-year-old equivalent of, "Oh crap," and I had one person who believed me. That same friend and I had some pretty crazy things happen after that, but those are stories for another time. Besides, only one of them is a ghost story. The rest are just stories. When I'm not being the most average, boring man, I tend to get myself into predicaments. If you don't believe this, I don't blame you. That said, every part of this story is true. I don't have answers. I don't know why us. Why then? I have been back there a few times, not at midnight. I'm only partially stupid, and never seen anything like that since. This is the most terrifying paranormal thing that's ever happened to me. It spans several years and several locations, and the central theme is a ventriloquist dummy I got as a child, but it all begins in the basement. I lived in a house up in the very northern tip of Idaho, around 1992 and 93. The house is still there today, still in exactly the same shape outside, but I hope for the sake of the current owners that they remodeled and repaired the basement. That basement wasn't huge. It had a large main room, basically a wide hallway, that had 2 doors leading to 2 small bedrooms. There was an uncarpeted cement floor and a little nook under the stairs, opposite the 2 rooms that we used for storage. In the spring, during the melt, the groundwater would leak into the basement due to a faulty sump pump. Because of that, the whole place would smell of mildew and mold. I'm fairly certain I spent a small chunk of my life living with some sort of mold in my bedroom. Probably not healthy, and it could have accounted for the weird things that had happened in that dingy basement. I would believe that if the events that span this tale hadn't taken me into my adult life and several states away. It all started with a puppet, a snail puppet named Snaily. When I was about 6, my family gave him to me, a glorified sock puppet with a long tube neck for my arm and a shell at the back. I was very good at making it talk for me and giving it expression. I even figured out how to make him retreat into the shell when he was upset. I really enjoyed it and planned on making a life out of it. So much so that on my 7th birthday, my grandparents gave me a Muppet. He was a grey furry fellow with a big felt mouth and a stick attached to one arm. His legs ended in Velcro covered feet that could wrap around me and seemed like he was sitting on my hip. I fell in love. He was an extension of me, always on my hip and always cracking jokes. I loved that little fuzzball and started looking up ventriloquism at my library. My grandfather caught wind of my interest and decided he would help me by getting me a ventriloquism dummy. It was a cheap replica of Charlie McCarthy, the famous dummy that all Hollywood dummies are based on. That doll was awesome to the 7-year-old budding ventriloquist inside me. I didn't care that he only had a cheap pull string to make him talk, and that his velvet hat fell off his head every time I moved him. I loved him. He had a hard head and hands, molded plastic. His right eye had a slot carved out to hold a plastic monocle. I lost that monocle pretty early in owning him. He had a felt hat that got beaten up pretty quickly by me, so it was misshapen, but I had managed to hold onto it all through his stuff. His jacket could be removed. His whole torso and arms were white cotton. The elbows were just strips of sewn thread dividing a long tube cloth. My doll's hair had a scuff at the back of the partition, showing the flesh-colored plastic under the paint. He had 2 plastic shoes that you could tie, but I had lost one years ago. Inside the other one, I had painted 2 letters with white paint. The letters were part of my last name, so I won't divulge what they were, but they were distinct and very much support to my claim that Toy Story was a rip-off of my life, as it came out 2 years after the events in this story. This is what the bastard looked like. I hate it with a burning passion, and looking at it makes me sick to my stomach. The last detail he had was a braided nylon loop sticking out of the base of his neck. When pulled, his mouth would move. When my family split, he ended up going with my father, while I lived with my mum in Utah. Eventually, we bounced from place to place, splitting our time between my mother and father in different states. Thus, in the final half of the 5th grade, I moved back to Idaho, into my father's new home, and into a hellish nightmare that was the basement. When I moved back in, I got a lot of toys my father had been storing, including Charlie. By that time, I was nearly 11, and I had forgotten about my love for ventriloquism. But seeing Charlie again reignited that flame, and I was at it again, until a couple of months later, when I got my first computer. Suddenly, learning DOS Basic and playing Wolfenstein 3D became my new obsession. I cast Charlie into my moldy closet and moved on to more adult things. Eventually, he was put away by my father for safekeeping. From the moment I moved into that house, the basement was my greatest fear. When I found out my dad was sticking me in that dingy, unfinished basement bedroom with no carpet and mold on the walls, I pitched a fit. Not because it was gross,
but because I was terrified of that whole space, the stairs leading up to the house were open-faced. I could see into the small storage space under the stairs, and it always felt like something was back there waiting to grab my legs. I used to book it up the stairs at top speed in hopes to avoid that fate. The only light in the main room was a single bulb, hanging at the end of a long wire. It wasn't designed to be like that. The wire should have been in the ceiling, and the bulb was hanging from the mount that should have been attached to the ceiling. My father mounted it twice during my stay in that house, but both times it was down and swinging within a week. There was a wood-burning stove in the middle of the main room. It needed to be fed every couple hours during the winter to keep the house warm. Of course, as someone who is terrified of the basement, the job of feeding the fire fell on my scrawny little shoulders. So it was one day in the middle of winter. I was in the basement feeding the fire. Since I had moved in there, I had experienced weird things. Bumps in the night, stuff falling off a shelf while no one was near, the normal. However, this was the first time I had lived there that something truly terrifying happened to me. As I was struggling to open the door to the stove, I heard a deep guttural growl from below the stairs to my right. I froze, hoping it was my dog hunting mice, and slowly, without looking at the stairs, loaded the fire with a couple of logs. I closed the door to the stove and slowly turned to look at the stairs, when behind me, I hear a voice, clear as day. "I will kill you," whispered in a harsh, deep male voice. I lost it. I screamed and ran up the stairs. I think I only touched 3 steps out of 13 leading up to the main house. I ran to the back of the house, a new addition. By new, probably 40 years old, and huddled under the blankets, crying. I never wanted to go back into the basement, but eventually, I had to go back to my room. From that point on, every bump, every scrape, every little sound had me on edge while I was down there. Time passed. Eventually, I put the voice into the back of my mind, convincing myself that I had imagined it. I always had a rational mind, one that I used to explain away all strange things that happened to me. Finally, as things tend to do, it was pushed into the back of my mind, and I lived with just a general fear of the basement again. Until one day, again while feeding the fire, I got a sense of dread in my chest, something I couldn't put my finger on, but it got my pulse racing. I began to nope it up the stairs when the one thing I had always feared happened. Something grabbed my leg from under the stairs. I freaked and went lightheaded. I couldn't figure out what was happening. I couldn't decide if this was real life or a dream. I know I jumped backwards. I was nearly at the top of the stairs, and I didn't land on a single step on my way down. The way my body twisted as I pulled away from something holding me had me land square on my back on solid concrete. I felt the wind rush from my lungs, and then I passed out. I don't know if it was from the impact or fear. I just know I lost consciousness. I don't know how long I was out. I do know when I came to, my head hurt more than it ever had in my life. I was dizzy and not fully aware of my surroundings, and I crawled up the stairs and into the main part of the house. I laid down on the couch and fell asleep. My dad got home a few hours later and woke me up. I told him what had happened. He looked me over for any serious injury before telling me that it must have been a dream. I was tired and lethargic for a few days after that, but eventually I felt normal, and I ended up deciding that it had to be a dream. Stuff like that didn't happen in real life. Thinking back on this now, I may have suffered a head injury and should have gone to the hospital, but my dad was very much the walk it off type. My brother knew my fears and would torment me as much as possible, jumping out at me or sending me to get things from the basement just because he knew I was afraid. The worst thing he did to me
was move stuff around my room at night. My room didn't have a door, so it was easy to sneak in and move stuff around. He would put my toy chest in front of the doorway, or turn my desk upside down and put my chair on it. Never anything subtle about it. I didn't want to fuel his behavior, so I never got upset about it. I just moved things back. My mum always told me he would grow tired of his pranks if he didn't think they were working. Old school don't feed the trolls moment. Eventually, it stopped, or so I thought. One night, my brother's prankster spirit came out in full force. I woke up to a loud knock on my closet wall. I looked over, and in the light of the nightlight, I could see my dummy, Charlie, sitting on top of my toy chest, facing me. I laughed a little nervous laugh. Charlie had been put away in a garbage bag with all the other stuffed animals I didn't use any longer. The bag was stored in a shed in the backyard. I was proud of my brother for the effort. This had more subtlety in class than his other pranks. I fell back to sleep. A while later, I was awoken with another knock, and I sat up, hoping to catch my brother doing something else. This time, Charlie was on the floor, sitting upright facing my bed. I rolled my eyes and sighed. I respected the conviction, but I was too tired to deal with it anymore, so I fell back to sleep. One last time, I was awoken. This final time, the doll was on my chest. I flipped and ran into my brother's room, yelling at him to stop messing with me. The only problem was, his room was empty, and it slowly dawned on me that he hadn't been home all day and was planning on spending the night at his friend Nick's house. I'd been alone in the basement all night. It was quite some time later that I discovered he had never moved anything in my room. In fact, by all accounts, my brother did everything he could to not go into my room. It gave him the creeps. I felt like I was going insane. I couldn't fathom how the doll had ended up on my chest, or how it got inside in the first place. I ran upstairs, crying uncontrollably. My dad's door was locked, so I climbed onto the couch and fell asleep with my face buried in fear. The next day, I woke up on the couch, and it all felt like a dream. Still, I was done with the basement. I started sleeping on the pull-out couch after that. I don't remember the story I told my dad, something about the mold bugging me, but I never slept in that room again. Luck was on my side, and the basement started to flood heavily the next few months, and my dad eventually moved me into the room upstairs with my sister. I thought my troubles were over, but that was just the beginning of the nightmare that spanned almost 10 years of my life. See, after Charlie had showed back up in the basement, I refused to sleep down there ever again. It was the first time I stood up to my father about anything. He tried to force me to stay in the basement, but I'd wait until he was asleep, and then move myself to the den and sleep on the couch. He'd get up for work every day to find me sleeping on that couch. Eventually, he stopped trying to make me go into the basement. It was summer by this time, and I have fond memories of staying up all night playing NES, and then riding my bike to the beach every morning to swim for hours. Despite what happened near the end of the season, I still hold that to be the best summer of my life, because I felt so free. That might have a lot to do with my dad working all the time, so I didn't feel the normal foreboding fear that I was going to do something to make him mad at me as often, and could be myself without judgment. I slept in that den for the whole summer, but my dad didn't like the idea of me sleeping on the couch all the time, so eventually he moved my bed and my toys into my sister's room. This was 93, so she would have been 8 at the time, and I was just about to make that full-time rush into puberty, which made the situation uncomfortable to me. However, we made do, and I just avoided the room unless I was sleeping, but I had to maintain her bedtime. So I was in bed super early, and I didn't like that. I made do by reading under the blankets and playing my Game Boy by the light of my book light. No big deal, I adapted. But I missed the freedom of the den. When my dad moved all the toys and my bed into the room, I distinctly told him to put Charlie back into the shed. I watched him throw it in a plastic bag that had all my other dolls and puppets from my younger years. He wasn't pleased that I made him do this, saying I was being dumb and I needed to grow up and stop dragging him into my games of pretend. Well, one night, before school started, I was sleeping soundly on my back, something I never do anymore, when I felt a weight on my chest. It was heavy and, I don't know how to say this any other way, pointy, like there were odd angles to it, pressing into me. At first I thought it was my dog, a 40-pound Springer Spaniel, but it felt wrong, too small. I know this sounds like a sleep paralysis demon, but two things pushed this outside sleep paralysis for me. One, I started flailing immediately, no paralysis involved. Two, I opened my mouth to scream when something hard and plastic shot into it and pressed into the back of my throat. I flailed around, grabbing at the thing on my chest, but it was weird, like it was covered in a cloth that had a lot of give, but it also was firm and heavy for something so small. The top of it was round plastic, and I kept trying to push it, but it wasn't moving, and I couldn't roll to my side. Eventually, my wild attempt to get this thing off me and out of my mouth, I was barely able to breathe, and I've had a distinct fear of suffocation to this day. My hand latched onto the part that was hanging off the main mass, a single string at the base of the hard plastic top. That's when I realized what this was. It was Charlie. I could feel it now. The weight of him on my chest was like someone had filled him with lead instead of fluff. It was his hand in my mouth, making me gag as it tried to push deeper in. I think realizing what it was on me helped me panic less. I felt like I needed to see him. I needed to make him real, I guess. So I fumbled around, grabbed my book light and turned it on. The second there was light in the room, the doll was just a doll. He slumped on my chest, and the wet cotton arm that ended in a rigid plastic hand fell out of my mouth, as if I had been sucking on it, not choking on it. I stared hard at the doll, coughing and crying, and scared as hell. I had realized earlier this summer, no one in my house cared about what was happening to me, and I had nowhere to turn. I simply sat in bed with a small ring of the light illuminating that damn doll. Something I used to love, and now despised. I don't know how long I sat there, but by the time the batteries died on my light, the sun was coming up, casting a soft light in the room. By the time I left my room, my throat was extremely sore. I never fell back asleep. I know that much for sure. It's the only reason I don't think it was all a bad dream. Well, that and the other nightmarish things that happened involving that doll. That day, after my father had left for work, I took my frustrations out on the doll. I smashed its face in, I kicked him, I took him and swung him around, smacking him against my porch outside. I was working some stuff out, okay? After that, I took him back into the shed and saw that the bag he was in had a small hole in it, about the size of his head, so I wasn't going to take any chances. I put him in a toy chest I had in the shed. It was a square with the Ninja Turtles painted on all sides, with a lid that locked. I shoved him in there and locked the lid, declaring victory, which worked for a while. I didn't see him again that summer. The last time I saw Charlie in Idaho was after school had started. I had just come home from school, and my girlfriend had come home with me. She was a cool kid, I really liked her, despite not knowing what a romantic relationship really was. But this was the last time we ever hung out. We got home and dumped our backpacks on the floor next to my front door and sat down to watch Star Trek TNG. It's part of why we were friends. She loved Star Trek and so did I. We watched it together every day after school until her mum picked her up. It should be noted that though the backpacks weren't visible, from where my couch was,
The only way to get to the bags was to pass by us, in between us and the TV screen. Kind of hard to miss. Well, halfway through the episode we were watching, our backpacks flew across the room. They didn't roll or slide. They passed in front of the TV, in the air, like someone had chucked them. She screamed, I screamed, but there was no ice cream involved. We ran over to the bags, then we looked back at where they came from. Just sitting against the door, with a smug air about him, was Charlie. It was like he was taunting me. The girl didn't know what was happening, or why I was so much more freaked out than her. My mind was racing, and I decided the only thing to do was make sure he was gone forever. Now, an adult would think fire, but to a 6th grader, fire was not on the menu. I decided to bury him, and the girl got conscripted into helping me. She was scared and confused, but eventually, she did help. I got my dad's shovel and took Charlie to the woods behind my house. I dug a deep hole, super deep, to a preteen that would have been at least 3 feet. I threw Charlie in, and the girl said the "as I lay me down to sleep" prayer while I buried him. I don't know what it's called. I never was a church kind of guy, but after I finished, I put a set of crossed sticks on the dirt and covered the mound with pine needles. And that was it. The girl broke up with me when she left my house that day. The next summer, I moved back in with my mum and never looked back at Charlie or that house again. I never told anyone, neither did the girl as far as I know. Not that it mattered. I never saw anyone who knew me from Idaho ever again. Even when I went back, I didn't run into any old friends. So I grew up, moved to California for high school, met a girl, fell in love, as one does. Eventually, roughly 1998, my dad moved out to Cali to be closer to the kids he used to neglect, and brought with him all the things that we left behind, hoping we would equate nostalgia with love. I kept that Ninja Turtle box out and left the toys in it. Don't worry, he wasn't in the box. The rest of the stuff went into the attic we had, a small crawl space with very little room, and that was that. 2 years passed after Dad had moved away from that property. It was January of 2000. We had all survived Y2K. Life was good. I had dropped out of school the year before, so I was working for McDonald's and taking every shift I could. Things were kind of growing stale between me and my girlfriend. We'll call her A. A was kind of mean, honestly, but she was hot and I was fat, so I thought I'd never get anything better. So one day, after a morning shift of work, I came home and she was waiting on my porch. She knew I would be home alone, and she wanted to do the thing that 17-year-old kids do when they can be alone together. And though I was beginning to dislike her, I was 17 years old. We went into my house, went into my room, and I was trying to convince her to let me take a shower to get McMuffin stink off me, when she asked why my bed was so dirty. I turned around, and on my bed was a small set of sticks, crossed under a pile of pine needles. That made little sense, because there were no pine needles around my house. Also, though you've made the connection, I'm sure, I did not. I simply commented on how weird that was, brushed them onto the floor, and did what I had come to do. It was later, after, we were sitting together talking, and she said something about not knowing I had such a cool doll. I followed her gaze, and sitting on the turtle box was dear old Charlie. Now, I won't lie to you, I screamed. I got really dizzy, and I thought I was going to pass out. I started hyperventilating as a ton of memories all caught up to me at once. The thing is though, this guy was fresh. He still had his jacket. I lost it years before the whole basement thing. His hat was perfect. He had his monocle, and both shoes. A didn't know why I was freaking out so hard. I asked her to check inside his shoe. She said there was white paint inside, with my special mark for my last name. I ran over and grabbed him, As I picked him up, I realized what the pine needles meant. I spun around and looked next to the bed where they had all been swept off. There was nothing on my floor. I told A, and she started to get why I was so upset. I checked the doll all over. He had the same bald spot, everything. This wasn't just a doll, this was him. A wanted to know the story, so I explained it all over my Weber grill. I learned plastic stinks when it burns and leaves a residue at the bottom of charcoal grills. I also learned that I wasn't as crazy as I thought, because as he burned, we both swore he was screaming. A part of me wants to think it was just air escaping his head as it melted, but I don't think that's the truth. Anyway, the long-lasting repercussions of those events means I get terrified of any dolls. I can't do ventriloquism and can't watch the Goosebumps movies, because guess who R.L. Stine based the looks of his haunted dummy off of? I swear everyone steals my life story. Also, my wife, not A, bought a Charlie McCarthy doll from Goodwill just to mess with me. It isn't the same doll. I've never seen it. I just forced her to leave it at her parents' house across the country. She also laughed at me while I was struggling to find a decent picture of him for this story. That's true love right there.